Welcome to Sports CTO Talks. In this series, we would be connecting with industry leaders from sports and technology, where we will simplify sports technology. I am Ami, your guide on this journey through the minds of amazing tech leaders who are shaping the future of sports. We will dive deep into discussions and innovations driving the industry, from AI to cloud, from cybersecurity to sustainability. If it is a sports tech, we are talking about it. Today, we have an interesting guest with us, David Gill. He is the managing partner and performance lab director at 𝗲𝗲𝗰𝗵𝗹𝗲𝗀, a pioneer in IMU performance monitoring. With expertise in biomechanics, injury prevention, and movement analysis, David has managed data of 500 plus elite teams and athletes, shaping how data-driven insights optimize training and reduce injuries. Beyond product development, he consults across sports, military, and rehab sectors, designs cutting-edge movement assessments, and leads coaching clinics nationwide. His mission is helping athletes move better, train smarter, and stay in the game longer. Before joining 𝗲𝗲𝗰𝗵𝗹𝗲𝗀, David owned a fitness facility specializing in Olympic lifting, mobility, movement mechanics, and physiotherapy. We welcome you, David, to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So today he would be talking to all the listeners, to all the viewers, more about load management into sports and how technology is shaping the future of athlete wellness. So David, my first and a very basic question to you is, to the listeners, because we have not taken any topic which we are discussing today, we would go from the basics to covering it 360 degrees. What is the fundamental difference between load management, load monitoring, and what is the distinctions? Why is the distinction important in athlete performance?
Sure. And yeah, to start from the very basics, we define these terms. A lot of we'll just say sports fans, consumers hear the words load management, load monitoring. In general, the concept, when people think about it, they think of, well, teams are tracking how much their athletes are training, how much workload. But I like breaking it down that way, the difference between load monitoring and load management, because a lot of this started with load monitoring, and there are still teams that are load monitoring and not load managing. So let's distinguish between the two. Load monitoring is any means by which you are objectively tracking training load or workload, or how hard your athletes are working, how much your athletes are working. And there are a lot of teams in any sport that are tracking this information, but until it becomes load management, it's almost useless. What I mean by that is the distinction between load monitoring and load management is action. Are you actually using the data and information you're collecting to make decisions? Is the data actionable? When I first started working with 𝗲𝗲𝗰𝗵𝗹𝗲𝗀, we're primarily in the volleyball space, and we were the first to really introduce external load monitoring in volleyball, because you could count jumps for the first time ever. It was a major breakthrough. It was awesome. But I remember talking to a lot of the coaches in the early days. We're talking 10 years ago, and they would say, "Well, yeah, we're getting all this information. It's really cool. I have no idea what I'm doing with it."
Okay.
That's more load monitoring. That's more load monitoring.
Correct.
Versus now, those coaches can use that data to help with their practice planning and make changes. That's load management.
Okay. So how do internal and external load management or load measurements differ? And how should they be balanced in a training program of an athlete?
Sure. So first, to define internal versus external load management. Both are important. You'll find in some sports, one is kind of more relevant than the other. So internal is, as you imagine, inside, you're looking at HRV, heart rate variability, heart rate monitoring, more cardiovascular load, versus external load, what's happening outside, your distance traveled, your jump count, impact on the body, those kind of external stresses. And again, both of them can be very useful, especially if you know what you're doing when you're looking at the data and how to apply it. But I'll give you an example, like with internal load monitoring, heart rate variability. You have sports like, soccer, basketball, like very cardiovascular driven sports. That's really, really important. We kind of came into popularity in volleyball, indoor volleyball, because while it's still important, the external loads, the jumping and the landing, tells you a bit more of a comprehensive story in terms of what's going on with the athlete. So having both of those is certainly ideal, but now we're looking at budgets and even more data. Aside from external, internal loads, I also like to also talk about RPE, which stands for rate of perceived exertion. Some listeners may have heard of that. That is a subjective measure where you're rating how hard or intense the practice was from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and they're taking that number and kind of multiplying it by how long practice was to give you an idea of external load. Subjective measure, there's still more research supporting that as a very effective means of monitoring load. So even though I live in data and objective numbers, I still like to tell people, because the mission is athlete health. If you're not using any kind of wearable device, still getting a load from RPE from your athletes can be incredibly beneficial, incredibly powerful.
So like when you were talking about athlete health, a question is, how to measure injuries or how to take care of the health of an athlete, the wear and tear or the long-term impacts of the game.
Mm-hmm. Well, the name of the game is obviously reducing injuries. So when we look at wearables, some people like to look at it different ways. I've had coaches say, well, I'm more interested in using it for injury prevention, or I'm more interested in using it for performance optimization. Load management is performance optimization in large part through injury risk mitigation. That's a mouthful, but essentially you're going to perform better if you're healthier. Period. The end. So when you're looking at athlete health, the way you plan with load management is it gives you insights into individual athletes, and it allows you to ideally not receive the injury by making smart changes. So one of the other things I jokingly say to people when they say, well, how many injuries is this going to reduce if I do this? It's like, well, you can't quantify the injuries that didn't happen because you changed your plan as a result of the data. Right? I mean, we can look at averages, but you can't directly quantify that. If you could, this kind of technology would be mandated at all levels, So the challenge, and I have this conversation with many coaches, is they're like, yeah, our injuries have decreased dramatically. So we know it's working, something's working, but I don't know if because, and I'll give you an example with some of our data. In volleyball, if we see an athlete, we can measure how stiffly they land. Okay. And typically as they fatigue, they tend to land harder. Or if an athlete's injured their ankle, now they're landing harder because they're compensating. And so we'll say like, hey, might be going on with this athlete. We've seen a real spike in their we call elevated landing percent. And the coach will go and talk to them about it. And eventually they'll break down and say, yeah, okay, well, my ankle hurts or something like that. It's like, okay, well, we're not going to sit you. Don't worry, because no athlete wants to sit, right? They want to be in the court. We're going to cut your volume down by 15 to 20% and see how you do. And in many cases, that was sufficient. They get a little more recovery. They feel better. They didn't miss playing time. They didn't decondition. They're good to go. Did making that change prevent an injury? We will never know. However, based on all the research, we know that it does.
Yeah,
whether in that case it would have. So that's really how you want to look at it for kind of more detailed situations.
Okay. And there are technologies coming in every day. You talk about AI, you talk about wearables, you talk about GPS or anything for that matter. So how load monitoring is integrated into that, and how is it useful and how does it work?
Yeah, so depending on what you're trying to track, there are different technologies. And like you said, it's constantly changing. I mean, constantly changing. And it's not just, this is going to sound a little odd. It's not just what's the best data. It's what's the data that the coaching and training staff best understand how to use, right? Any wearable system worth its salt is collecting a ridiculous amount of data points, right? So our vert system measures in a practice, we have over 1 million data points we're looking at. Wow. The coach isn't, because that's a waste of time. And while there are some really, really relevant numbers that I might look at as a sports scientist that I can use, day to day, there's so much going on. It's about finding what I always tell them. I said, what are the top 3 metrics that are going to be maximally useful? In soccer, it might be your distance traveled, it might be sprint zones, and especially for females, because of the increased rate of ACL injuries, it might be deceleration. In volleyball, it might be jump count, jump height, landing impact, or it might be jump count, energy, and landing impact. It's what is most translatable to the coach to then use for your plan. You have programs that are able to integrate that with sleep, which is critically important. But then you run into other things like at the college level, you can't really tell kids you need to go to sleep. But college athletes, tell them you want them to. So with the vast amount of technologies, I really think what it's getting at, it needs to be accurate, it needs to be valid, of course. Assuming that's the case, the only other thing that's important is the data actionable? Is it actionable? If you don't know how to use energy in joules per pound as an actionable data piece, okay, how can we make that more actionable? That becomes a question. Doesn't matter what wearable technology you're talking about.
Okay. So like when you were saying this, my next question is like, how can AI or machine learning improve real-time decision making for athletes into this segment?
Yeah, so that's a fun topic. You have like where it is now versus where it'll be very, very soon.
Okay.
In terms of real-time decision making, I know there's some AI that's not as much on the load monitoring side. The AI is being used more on the statistics side. What are we seeing on the field? Because, for example, if we're tracking, in a game, especially if it's an important game, you're not going to sit there and say, well, our star player ran a little more than we wanted them to, we're pulling them. Or you hit your jump count goal, we're pulling you from the game because this 5-set match is going too long. That's never going to happen. What AI is going to help with there in real time is more of like, should we change our rotations because we were more successful there? And that's also kind of a gray area. Is that AI or is that just statistics? On the load management side, what's fascinating about the future of AI is a lot of load management is a numbers game. We play with percentages. You want to increase workload at certain percentages, and decrease workload at certain percentages. So AI can take that, understand those percentages, and as it gets more informed with individualized data, like we know based on historical data, at this part of the season, this player's knee starts to hurt, and so AI knows this is coming, so let's decrease by 20% this week, increase by 10 the next, and play with those numbers. That's where I see it really, really helping a lot.
Okay. So what role does biomechanics play into load monitoring?
So biomechanics is part of the nuance of load monitoring. And what I mean by that is, 10 kilometers run on the pitch by this player does not equal the same amount of physical load as 10 kilometers run by this player, right? Just like if you have middle blockers in volleyball, 100 jumps to her is not 100 jumps to her. It's not the same. It could be very similar, but it depends on how they move, right? So one of the things that we track is energy. And admittedly, it's a complex metric. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned it earlier, so-and-so's energy was 4,227 joules per pound. Okay. You don't want to sit there and have to explain what joules per pound means to coaches, but it's good for this question, because you could have 2 athletes do the same exact practice, the same number of reps, and one has 30% higher energy every practice. And that's based on how they move. It might be because they're flat-footed, inefficient. They may land poorly, right? So if we're tracking an athlete and they both jumped 100 times, but this athlete, we call elevated landing percent. We can actually in real time see how stiffly they land. Incredible metric in volleyball. How well are they attenuating or absorbing that ground force? So if I know in a season that an athlete is starting to land harder than another, their likelihood of injury is up. So if I'm managing their load, they may not be able to handle as high a load as someone who, lands like a cat, really absorbs everything. Maybe has better mobility than this athlete. It's like, well, you're not going to train as much. We're going to focus more on mobility and getting you stronger and more balanced and more stable. But that's how you can take it. The biomechanics, you have to understand that. The wearables will help you. They'll point things out. Like, this person isn't moving as well. You still have to look at why. And there's other technologies for that. There's 3D motion capture, there's 𝗲𝗲 systems, things of that nature. But even if you don't have that, it's like, well, why are you landing hard?
Okay. So like, what are the pros and cons of, like, what you said? How can it benefit? And are there any disadvantages to it?
Well, the disadvantage I sort of alluded to earlier, and that's the disadvantage is just overanalysis.
Okay.
I recently was speaking to one of my coaches who said, you have to trust your eyes, but you have to trust your eyes a little less than maybe you think you should. It kind of goes the other way as well. It's like, you have to trust the data, like, because, jump counts, jump height, landing's landing, jump, but it has to be a balance of intuition. We have programs where we'll actually help script their training load. And it's funny to me. Some of them will, like, the number we put, they will hit and they will stop.
Okay.
Like, they'll just stop. It's enough, but you have other people like, well, that's more of a guide. And that's really what it is. It is a guide. You can be specific. Specificity is good. But when you start drowning in data and you're trying to, here's the other biggest point. The biggest challenge or mistake people make is when they start to pick the data specifically that supports what they think it should. You understand?
Yes, absolutely.
It's like, I feel like this girl hasn't been trying, and if I actually, I'll give you a funny example. You think the girl's not trying, she's not giving effort because her energy's low, and you're trying to push her, and then you see that her average jump height was low. Well, it's the reason we use two different metrics for that. We have your average jump height, just the average of all your jump heights, which I never look at. And we have what's called average high. We take the top 20% of their highest jumps because we can safely assume they were really trying there. We average that. And I've had coaches say, well, no, she's not working. I was like, her average high is doing great. Her average is down because she's been celebratory hopping. Like, yay! And, it's like,
yes.
But they don't. So it's like, or I've had times where like, yeah, I think maybe this player's tired. And then you sit there and say, well, you think you're tired, but in volleyball, you have what's called in-system, out-of-system. In a nutshell, if you're out of system, that means it's a little more chaotic, right? Your setter is not where they're supposed to be because maybe it was a bad serve reception. And you go look at the video, it's like, well, she wasn't tired. Like, she didn't get a good set, like, all game. So she's hitting over here, she's hitting over here, she's not getting a maximal jump. So you have to be cautious when you're looking at the data. You need as much context as you can have, right? Because this data is amazing. It's not the end all be all. You need context around the data.
Okay. So like, when you were talking about this, what are the key signs to identify that an athlete is getting overburdened or, exhausted? Or like, what are the key signs into that, understanding that?
Sure. And it depends what system you're using, right? Like heart rate, cardiovascularly does a really phenomenal job. Phenomenal job. You have to first individualize your kind of thresholds for each athlete. And then you have an idea of, what they can handle, how many sprint zones, within the different heart rate zones, like how much time can they spend, in this one before they start to fatigue. And that's honestly, once you get the handle of it with those systems, it's pretty straightforward. and it'll literally color code it for you. It's like, oh, they're in the red, and they spent X amount of time in the red. And while that might be okay to an extent, that informs recovery. Right. So if we spent more time than we wanted to, we have to adapt. If you look at, you do the same thing with if they ran more or if they jumped more, we have to adapt. But we found, which is really interesting, and again, this goes to context, is jump height can sometimes be a good measure of fatigue. Like, wow, they're just not jumping as high, they're tired. But what research has shown is that as athletes fatigue in jumping sports, their jump height doesn't change as much as their jump speed, how long it takes them to jump.
Interesting.
So we have a new metric that we put out last year, which is cool. It's still a beta metric because it's fascinating, but we're actually looking at what's called the concentric load duration, how long it takes them from the bottom of their jump to launch, to see if that does a better job of correlating to fatigue. Additionally, we have found almost across the board, as athletes get tired, they land harder. They land stiffer. You want to take pressure off your muscular structure by minimizing flexion. You land stiffer, puts more pressure in your skeletal structure. Over time, that can be a very bad thing. And so we trend that out. So you look at that data and you can see, like, holy smokes, this person's, yep, they're starting to land harder. They're starting to land harder. Again, you want context. Can't just take one day where you did a move that's a hard landing move. But when you start to see those trends, you say, yeah, they're starting to land harder. Goes back to what we talked about earlier. Now what? Do you just cross your fingers and hope nothing happens? Or do you say, all right, let's reduce their training load a little bit and see if we can't fix this without having them have to take too much time off?
Like what you were saying, does that prevent acute or the chronic injuries which are happening? Does it help into that?
Yes, it's gonna primarily, what I specifically said here is gonna help, I believe, more with acute injuries, right? The ACL tears, the season enders. For the chronic injuries, yes, it'll help, but the main thing, like hard stop, the main thing that's going to help with reducing chronic injuries is the load management and making sure you start at a responsible lower load and then grow throughout the season. That is the number one thing that's going to help. And yes, proper warm-ups, nutrition, all these things are very important. But speaking generally, the load management piece absolutely is going to be the number one thing to help with chronic injuries, because you're not going to have those overuse injuries, and you're not going to have players starting the season at too high a load when their muscles, but more their tendons and ligaments, haven't developed the capacity to handle that load. We need to grow it slowly, or at least at a pace that's between 5 and 15% week over week. Those are kind of the ideal numbers, if you're able to. That allows for a more balanced athlete and a far more healthy athlete. So later in the season, you can be training more and still feeling good. So yeah, that's really the key to the acute versus chronic injuries.
So like, can you give a few examples into different sports, integrating this into different sports, the load monitoring approach, like other than soccer or volleyball, like how can it be used?
So it's actually interesting. A lot of people heard about load management, at least in the States, with the San Antonio Spurs. They were one of the first teams to start like really innovating and looking at load management. But you can make the argument, and this is still pretty new at that point, where they sat players maybe even a little too much, right? And that's the other side of it, is you don't want to overwork and you don't want to underwork. It's referred to as deconditioning. And so if you get the athlete into a deconditioned state and then they go and play, they can have more injuries that are closer to acute type injuries. From a planning standpoint, it's not that there aren't subtle differences between sports. The concept's the same. In no sport do you want to start really high, like right off the bat. No, we in every sport we need to build capacity. Doesn't matter how you're doing it, you need to build capacity. The main difference, frankly, is not even between sports as much as what's your schedule. Right? It's going to be very different in American football, where you play one game a week, but you're really not recovered for like 4 or 5 days after the game, versus NBA basketball, where you're playing 3 to 4 games in a week sometimes. And so there's no real practice load, right? Practice is going through, getting a little work in, getting a little lifting in, but it's recovery. You need to recover between games while working on fine-tuning things. Versus, look at, again, we'll say college volleyball, where you might play, on average, 2 games, Friday, Saturday, Friday, Sunday. Okay, we have time to get a lot of work in throughout the week. So each one of those sports, depending on their schedule, is really going to dictate how are you creating a load management plan. So yeah, it can change by sport, but it's really by schedule, I think, more than anything else.
Okay. And now I want to understand, as you were talking initially, like about data or overuse of the data, and you don't want to drown into it. So what is the role or reliance of technology and intuitions of coaches, and how can that be merged?
Well, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier, and this has been a learning curve for all of us in the industry, right? Because just because I'm sitting there in my lab and I think something's really, really cool, doesn't mean it's going to be useful, or as useful as I might think it is, because I'm not the one on the court. So one of the key things in this industry is really listening to your customer, like listening to coaches. Like, what is your goal? So anytime I speak to a program, I say, all right, why are you looking to do load management? I know it sounds like a general question, but specifically, why is it? And the answers vary, but it's almost always the same of like, well, in the middle of the season, we just kind of fall apart and we're getting injured, and I have no idea how much we're jumping or how much we're training. And I know that's important. Like, okay, good. Step one, it's important. And then I've had the next thing is like, who would be running the system? Who's actually collecting the data? Who's interpreting the data? Because it can't be the head coach. Like that you're doing a million things. There are rare exceptions where I've got a coach who's got a kinesiology degree and they're like, no, I love this stuff. I just do it at night. But there has to be delegation there. Otherwise, it takes a lot of time. As important as it is, it takes too much time. So then we find out who's going to do that. And then I don't know if this will be a question you ask later. The other question I get all the time too is how much interaction should my athletes have with the data?
Absolutely.
Because that's a fascinating one. And I have some coaches who really, really don't want to show that to their players because they don't want it to be a distraction. I say most programs do show it, and for different reasons. One might be motivational. Like, let's just put the leaderboard of who's jumping the highest just to push them. But specific story, I was visiting a couple universities, and one of them I'd worked with for years, and in Virginia. And at the end of practice, I saw one of the upperclassmen go over to a freshman, and they looked at the iPad with our system on it. I didn't know what they were looking at. I thought they were just looking at jump heights or something. She puts her hand up. She gives her a high five. And I'm listening, and I thought she'd say, oh, great practice. And she goes, you landed great today. I was like, dang, that makes my heart smile. Because that was an athlete who, in the spring season, is working on her landing. And so because they go to the app, they look at the data, they can own it. So I'm a big proponent of sharing it with your players. And yes, you have individual situations where players get obsessed with it, right? You have to control it. But when you share it with them, because the data is coming from their body, it's about them, they can really own that, and they can work on those things themselves, which takes pressure off the coach, where the coach isn't having to remind them constantly because the data is there as a reminder, and it can show them if they're improving or not. Like, that's one of my favorite use cases, is when the athlete takes some ownership of it, even though the coach is the one doing the overall planning.
So can this create a psychological burden on the athletes? And like, if yes, how to reduce it or how to manage it?
Yeah, it's a perfect next step. And it's an individualized answer, because you'll have athletes who take it, they own it, and they improve. And then you have athletes who take it and they obsess over it. And they're probably the same athlete who might be obsessing over their body weight, or they might be obsessing over how much they lift on a certain lift. And it's just one more thing on top of their student, schedule and all these things. You have to know your athletes. You have to know your athletes. And there are plenty of teams that, some athletes are like, I don't want to look at data. Okay, cool. If you're interested in it, let's do it. I'll do a lot of calls with athletes, which I love to do, because if you do have an athlete who is, studying sports science or exercise science, kinesiology, things of that nature, they also become really fascinated in it. I can genuinely say I don't have any stories where it burdened beyond the coach just being like, all right, enough. Don't stop. Like, don't hit every time and go look at your jump. That's a little extreme.
Yeah.
Right?
True.
Like everything else, there's a balance. But I'm still a very big proponent of giving the athletes some ownership of their information. So as they're the ones working so hard to improve, they can see, not only am I, improving on the court, but physically I'm improving. I feel good. Is that leading to better performance on the court? That's the most important thing. Oh, cool. And does that also line up with the data? It's kind of just validates your work. Or
Absolutely.
in some cases it doesn't, right? So, but that's a whole nother story.
So like when you talk about data and like so much data with so many people, like how can you manage the privacy or the ethical considerations, or like should it be given, should it be not given, should it be shared? Like there are so many questions on those lines also. So how to
Yeah,
go about that?
so there are a couple different things there. You have certain AMS, athlete management platforms, where those are highly, highly secured, because you're taking maybe your wearable data and you're also putting in their medical information. That is a very different story versus like our platform. We have jump numbers and landing numbers and the information that's on the roster. So you break it into what's called biomedical data, right? A lot of these teams don't have biomedical data. If you have heart rate, that kind of starts, that's internal load, that starts falling into the biomedical piece.
Okay.
And yeah, they're especially in Europe, and the US is now becoming more strict with that at the collegiate level. We've had certain professional clients where we've had to send their data to a separate server, because they're like, we don't want there to be even the slightest chance. There's always a chance.
There is
always a chance. But that just depends on the team, really, and how much they want to protect that data. One thing I will say, which is interesting, is we have a lot of athletes that will transfer to different programs. And these are all programs we work with. So then they'd say, well, the coach will say, well, what's their jump numbers? What are their landing numbers? And it brought up a really interesting question. Who owns the data? That's the question. Who owns the data? Well, the institution that purchased it obviously owns the data, but the player from which the data came also owns the data.
okay.
And so we came with a compromise where if a player goes to another school, we have to have written explicit permission with proof of who they are, saying that please share my average high and my landing data. Those are the two things, because you can't tell anything about what they did at the other school. You have data that's important to them, and they want to know, like, all right, how high do they jump? And they want to know, oh, are they a hard lander? They're a hard lander, so we might need to work on that right when they come in. Specific story, just this last season, we had a player go to a new school, and we had over, I think, 2 years of data on her. And it was fantastic, because I was literally, with permission, able to tell them, mid-season, she's going to start landing harder and her knees are going to start hurting.
Okay.
And it started happening. Like it's a pattern. And we'd done this before. So I said, so when we get to this point, let me know, right? As I said before, we cut her volume down a little bit, worked with the athletic trainer. She's preparing for it to come, got to the whole season healthy. I can tell you, based on historical data, if we didn't already know that that was going to happen, it would not have happened. It wouldn't have happened. So it was really great to see. And we've had that happen a few times where it's like, hey, if you keep going at this rate, every time you increase by this much, this player gets hurt. We know that. So let's not do that. But we knew that because I was able to look at her historical data with another team. And yeah, it's interesting because it's not like there's no law. There's no law on stating like, you can't do this. So, but we're always very, very upfront with our teams. Like, this is what we do, and this is why. We're never going to give you data from the other team that is competitive advantage, but it's about the player and things we can do to keep them healthy.
Absolutely. So, like, what are the new innovations happening into recovery management or recovery monitoring? Because that is very important at the end of the day. So,
massively, massively important. And when it comes to recovery monitoring, I'd say the most important thing, and this is going to sound so simple, because there are other kind of ultrasound technologies looking at the tendons, and you have blood work you can do. It's all very, very high level. Sleep.
oh, okay.
As sleep
That
monitoring
was-
gets better, there's nothing more important for recovery, period, the end, than sleep. There's other technologies that are really fascinating around the women's sports that look at menstrual cycles to also help with recovery. I think that's very, very fascinating, and that's going to have a massive, massive impact in terms of understanding like where your team is, and based on where your team is in the month, that should actually be an indicator or assist with where your high volume workload should be. Because it's true, that has a major physiological effect and can reduce recovery if you're working really hard during that time of the month. So some of that technology, I'm actually going to be at a conference in October, most likely, on a panel talking about some of that.
Okay.
Because that, like I said, a lot of the wearables, aside from helping you plan your load, some of those metrics provide the details for you to make changes to your load plan, right? That are backed in science and will ideally help you avoid an injury that you didn't know was coming.
Absolutely.
But really, those are the, I'd say, if I'm going to simplify this, those are the two things: the improvement in sleep tracking and some of the new wearable devices that help with the menstrual cycle that are going to assist with giving you more specific recovery plan. The other thing that's along the same vein is, and I bring this up because it was just brought to me the other day, is we look at periodization, right? So when your high day, low day is throughout the week. The science tells us roughly 72 hours of recovery and you're optimal, right? No one's going to like fully recover for 72 hours, right? So, but it should tell you that you should kind of like work your way up in practice, then kind of work your way down, and then you have game day. You should be optimal for game day. Well, certain players, I cannot specifically tell you why, but we've seen this on many occasions. They actually do better if you do what's called the reverse periodization model, where they're working harder leading into game day. Now, in theory, that could increase risk of injury. But on a number of occasions, we found that, well, we're not going to change. They're not jumping any more or less than their position group. We're just going to change what days have those higher numbers. And we're going to work them into the game. And suddenly you could see sometimes dramatic improvements in jump height. One athlete, I know this needs more context, but she jumped 2.5 inches higher on her average high when we changed her to a reverse periodization model, which is a ridiculous increase.
Yeah.
It's a collegiate athlete. She's a freshman, but still a collegiate athlete. And so we changed the periodization and boom, massive improvement in performance. So, yeah, so those are, again, some metrics you can use just to adjust. And the way she recovered was different. And then she would recover way more the next day, whereas other people would be in a higher day because she needed it.
Like, you know, when you were talking about improvement even of 2 inches, like, is it helping athletes who are aging or, you know, on the verge of finishing their career into sports? Does that extend their career in any way, or is it
It's a
helping them
great,
in any form?
it's a great question. You're going to see athletes have longer and longer and longer careers.
Okay.
You're already starting to see it. When I first started working here, actually, well, she got married. Her name was 𝗂𝗲𝗁𝗪𝗏 or 𝗂𝗲𝗵𝗹𝗲𝗁𝗪. She's an Olympian volleyball player. And she, frankly, she will tell you, she's like, I was not going to make the team, but she started tracking her jumps. She's the first athlete, I think, ever, actually, to put a wearable in her contract because she's playing overseas. She's playing in Europe. And she said, I will play with you this season. However, you have to monitor my jump load. And here are kind of the thresholds because my knees are shot at this point in my career, and I want to do one more Olympics. That's my dream. She did. She got another medal. And it's a beautiful story. We love it because she would tell you with a supreme level of confidence, if I wasn't watching my jumps, that never would have happened. She's like, it never would have happened. And the whole U.S. national team was using the system, so they kept monitoring her jumps. We work with pro players around the world. You have some sad stories. I've had athletes reach out to me before and say like, hey, I'm training in such and such country and I'm just getting destroyed. And we'll send them a sensor and we'll get the data back and we'll say, yeah, every day you're jumping almost triple your highest day you jumped at university. And we've seen athletes like just break. We want to get there before that happens. So a large part of my job or those in my field is also just educating, especially professional athletes, because yes, you're an asset to the organization, right? And LeBron James is a really good example of this. He's like, I'm taking it on myself to spend all this money. Famously, most people know he spends like $1 million+ a year just on keeping himself healthy because he has to invest in himself. Athlete, you don't have to spend that much money. But so I have athletes who are, their team doesn't use the system, but they do. They use the system, and yes, it will, without question, lead to much, much longer careers. And not even using it as older players, just because younger, they used it. They don't have nearly as much mileage necessarily.
Okay.
It will lead to longer careers.
I have a few more questions, but I'll ask you one last one. Like, how is the load monitoring, recovery monitoring, the management shaping up? And what do you see as an expert? What are the next 5 years into that?
You already mentioned AI.
That is there everywhere, David. That's there everywhere.
Yeah. That's a big future of it. I mean, from a technology standpoint, from a hardware standpoint, because in the end, the hardware is becoming less and less important, right? It's more about the algorithm and the software and the data, right? The hardware, like back in the day when we first had our jump sensor and it married this little thing, looks like a USB stick, and you jump and it counts your jump height, and I was like, oh, this thing is amazing. Now I sit here and I look and I've got 100 million+ jumps of data to learn from. You need the hardware to feed you, but then once you have that, now everyone has really cool hardware. That's almost all of them are using a lot of the same chips inside. That's not the unique part. Now they're talking about weaving it into clothing,
Okay.
right? Doing all these things. That's really fascinating tech. Not there yet. I've seen other technologies that look incredible, but then in practice they're not there yet. So on the tech side, that's coming. A lot of camera-based technologies becoming incredible, to where in some cases it can replace a lot of what the wearables are doing. We're kind of fortunate. It's hard with cameras unless you have a ton of them. to look at jump height and almost impossible to look at landing impact. There are always going to be certain things you need wearables for. You're not going to use a camera-based system to do your heart rate. You're not going to use a camera-based system, like I said, to look at landing impact or energy the way we do. But that's where it's going. And then, we'll talk a little bit more about AI. But the AI is going to make it's going to create a level playing field in terms of preparedness physically.
Okay. Perfect. Now we'll move on to the next segment of the podcast, that is rapid fire round. I'll ask you a few questions. You will have to be quick in answering. Cannot think, okay?
Okay.
If a sport could be played in zero gravity, which one would be the most exciting to watch? Name one.
You ever watch professional tag?
Okay. That's interesting. Would you rather have a smartwatch that predicts injuries or one that gives life coaching tips?
From me, it's got to be the smartwatch, as
Okay.
long as it gives me enough time to fix it before the injury happens.
Okay. If you could add one futuristic tech upgrade to your favorite sport, what would it be?
Say that again. If I could add
If you could add,
upgrade?
Yeah, absolutely. Futuristic tech upgrade to your favorite sport, what would it be?
I once went to a tennis match that was in the dark and everything was glow in the dark. Something like that in volleyball, where you could somehow immediately see and feel how hard the balls hit. I think that'd be really, really cool. But yeah, the glow in the dark tennis match was awesome.
Okay. Would you prefer a drone as your personal sports cameraman or a robot as your trainer?
I don't need the robot trainer, but my marketing team makes me film everything, so the drone would make my life way easier.
Okay. What's one piece of sports tech you think should be banned from being too powerful?
I don't know of anything that's too powerful. There is a device called the 𝗪𝗏𝗵𝗹𝗶. You definitely won't have heard of it. It's born from the military space. It's like a wearable thing you put on that's like cheating. It'll get you jumping higher in like 5 minutes. I guess I'll say that.
Okay. If you could have dinner with any one sports legends, past, present, who would it be?
Oh, dinner with anyone, past, present, who would it be? I have no idea, but I will tell you this. I've met a lot of professional athletes, and I got to spend some time with Olympian Carl Lewis.
Okay.
And I had such a great time. So I'll just go with Carl Lewis. I had a phenomenal time with that.
Okay. What's your go-to snack during any sports event?
My go-to snack during any sports event? Oh, mango jerky.
Okay, good one. Like now, I'll ask you one question. You will need to answer that into 30 seconds. Like, according to you, what is the role of AI into load monitoring and load management in sports?
All right. Well, I'll have to go back to what I said earlier. I think the role of AI moving forward is going to be a level playing field on the physical side of preparation, because there's so much data and research. Like I said, it's all based on numbers. AI eventually is going to be able to tell the coach, like, here's where your high day should be for this player. Here's how much they should be doing to peak on this day you have a game. It'll be that pointed. So really, now that physically they're prepared, the coach doesn't have to worry about that part as much. It's more the mental preparation. That is always going to be on the coach. That's what I call OI, the organic intelligence, where you need a person to do that. But the AI is going to just lead to longer careers, more health, and again, an even playing field in terms of, are they ready for game day?
Perfect. Thank you, David, for amazing insights and joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Really fun, great questions, especially those rapid fire ones.
Absolutely. So everyone, let's stay connected for more understanding about sports technology in the future. Please share this episode with your friends, families, and the people who love sports technology. Let's meet next week, next time. Until then, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep exploring.